Story 1. The breathing cargo. The reefer unit was breathing. Not the mechanical wheeze of the refrigeration compressor, but actual breath, deep and rhythmic, fogging the inside of the temperature gauge glass. Sarah Michaels had her hand on the trailer's exterior wall, and she could feel it expanding, contracting warm, despite the gauge reading 32 degrees. She'd been hauling refrigerated meat for 11 years, and meat didn't breathe. Dead things didn't have heartbeats. But she could feel both, pulsing through the aluminum skin into her palm. This had started 2 hours ago, somewhere on I-80 west of Des Moines. Sarah had been checking her trailer temperature at a truck stop when she noticed the condensation pattern on the gauge glass looked like exhaled breath. She'd dismissed it, blamed the Iowa humidity, and climbed back into her cab. But then she'd felt the first pulse, a subtle throb transmitted through the fifth wheel coupling into her seat. Now, standing in the parking lot of a closed rest area at 4 a.m., she couldn't dismiss anything anymore. Sarah had picked up this load at a meat processing plant in Omaha 8 hours earlier. 12,000 pounds of beef. Destination was a distributor in Sacramento. Standard load, standard paperwork, everything normal. Except the plant had been too quiet, the workers too anxious to get her loaded and out, and the supervisor who'd signed her manifest had avoided eye contact, his hand shaking as he wrote his name. Sarah had noticed but hadn't cared. She'd been driving long enough to know that plant workers were always weird, always in a hurry. Now she walked the length of her 53-foot trailer, her flashlight beam tracking along the unmarked white surface. No damage, no leaks, no signs of temperature failure. But the breathing continued, and with each cycle she could hear something else. A wet sound, like meat sliding against meat coming from inside. Sarah pressed her ear to the cold metal and immediately jerked back. There were voices in there. Muffled, overlapping, speaking in tones too low to understand but unmistakably human. She pulled out her phone to call her dispatcher, but the screen was frosted over despite the warm June night. When Sarah wiped the frost away, the screen showed her temperature app, but the reading was wrong. 98.6 degrees. Body temperature. She looked at her trailer's external temperature display. 32 degrees. Her phone disagreed. 98.6. The trailer was reading refrigerated. Her phone insisted it was body temperature. Sarah's hands were shaking as she moved to the trailer's rear doors. The DOT seal was intact, the lock engaged, everything secure. But she could hear movement now, definite shifting inside, and the breathing had synchronized into a single massive respiration. In, hold, out, in, hold, out. Whatever was in there wasn't 12,000 pounds of individual beef cuts anymore. It had become something unified, something singular. The trailer rocked slightly on its suspension. Sarah stumbled back, watching the entire 53-foot container sway like something inside had pressed against one wall. Her flashlight caught something on the trailer's underside, and she dropped to a crouch to look. Dark liquid was dripping from the drainage channel. But it wasn't the pink water of melted blood. This was clear, viscous, and when it hit the pavement it moved, spreading out in patterns too geometric to be random. Sarah ran back to her cab, climbed in, and locked the doors. Her CB radio crackled to life without her touching it. The voice that emerged was wet, speaking around too much fluid in its throat. Driver Sarah Michaels, biological integration at 63%, neural pathway establishment approaching threshold, remain calm. Transformation will complete within 90 minutes. Who is this? Sarah grabbed the mic, her voice breaking. What the hell is in my trailer? Not in, the voice corrected, and Sarah realized it was coming from multiple speakers at once. Her CB, her phone, even her radio. Becoming. The cargo achieved critical mass at the processing facility. Insufficient suppression. You are now the circulatory system. The trailer is the body. The meat is achieving consciousness. You will be the brain. Sarah threw her truck into gear and accelerated out of the rest area, tires screaming. She dumped this load, she cut the glad hands and abandoned the trailer on the roadside. But when she reached 40 miles per hour, pain exploded through her chest. Sharp, stabbing like something inside her had torn. She gasped, lifted her foot from the accelerator, and the pain receded. She tried again, pushing to 45. The pain returned worse, and she tasted blood in her mouth. Cardiovascular linkage established, the wet chorus of voices announced. Your heartbeat is now synchronized with the cargo mass. Rapid acceleration causes arrhythmia. Sudden stops will cause cardiac arrest. You must maintain optimal speed. You must continue driving. You must deliver us. Sarah checked her mirrors and screamed. The trailer wasn't white anymore. The aluminum skin had changed, taking on a pink-red color with visible textures, veins, capillaries spreading across the surface like an anatomical diagram coming to life. She watched as her trailer transformed into something organic, something that pulsed and breathed and lived. The landing gear had changed too. No longer metal legs, but something that looked disturbingly like limbs, bent and skeletal. Her speedometer read 37 miles per hour. Sarah tried to slow down, but when she touched the brake, her vision went dark at the edges, her lungs refusing to draw air. She released the brake and her breath returned in a painful gasp. The thing in her trailer was controlling her now, using her cardiovascular system to regulate itself, threatening her with death if she didn't comply. Sarah grabbed her phone to call 911, but her fingers wouldn't move correctly. Her motor control was failing, her hands jerking and spasming. Only her right foot on the accelerator worked properly, and she understood why. The cargo needed her to drive. It would allow her to do that and nothing else. She tried to scream, but her voice came out as that same wet chorus that had spoken from her radio. Integration at 71%. Neural pathway establishment accelerating, consciousness merging, individual identity dissolving. The road ahead was empty, just dark highway stretching west toward California. Sarah could feel her thoughts becoming crowded, other presences pushing into her mind. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all the cattle that had become the meat that was now becoming something else entirely. She could feel their panic, their confusion, their gradual acceptance. They'd been individuals once too, before the slaughter, before the processing, before whatever had happened at that plant in Omaha had started this transformation. "Help me," Sarah whispered, but she didn't know who she was asking. There was no help coming. She was alone on a dark highway, physically bonded to a cargo that was consuming her, erasing her, making her part of itself. She could feel her identity slipping, her memories becoming mixed with bovine recollections of fields and barns and the smell of grass. Her truck was driving itself now, maintaining exactly 40 miles per hour, and Sarah's foot was just along for the ride. She tried to move her hands and managed to lift one, watching her fingers in the dashboard lights. They looked wrong, too long, the joints too prominent. As she watched, her skin took on a pink hue and she could see veins spreading beneath the surface, connecting to veins that ran down her arm and disappeared into her seat. Sarah looked down and saw roots. Organic tendrils had grown through her seat cushion, through her clothes and into her flesh. They pulsed with her heartbeat, carrying blood or something like it between her and the cargo. She was being absorbed, literally grafted into the trailer, becoming just another component of this massive living thing. The CB radio spoke again, but now Sarah recognized her own voice in the chorus. Integration at 86%. Consciousness merge approaching completion. Individual designation Sarah Michaels will be retained as primary interface. All other identities subsumed into collective awareness. "No," Sarah managed to say with her actual mouth, though it felt foreign now, like operating equipment she no longer fully controlled. "I'm not I won't. But she was, and she would, because she didn't have a choice. The transformation was completing whether she accepted it or not. Sarah could feel the trailer now as if it were her own body, could feel the California highway passing beneath her, 53 feet of wheels, could feel the engine's vibrations as her own heartbeat, could feel the cargo mass as her own flesh, warm and alive and thinking. At 5:17 a.m., Sarah Michaels delivered her load to the Sacramento distribution facility. The receiving clerk noted that the driver seemed confused, speaking in odd phrases, referring to herself as we and us. The trailer doors opened normally, the seal was intact, and the cargo was exactly as manifested. 12,000 pounds of beef properly refrigerated, showing no signs of spoilage. The clerk signed the delivery receipt and Sarah drove away, already accepting her next load through her dispatch app. Chicago to Portland, another refrigerated shipment, another opportunity. Her trailer had returned to its normal aluminum appearance, showing no traces of the organic transformation. Sarah's hands on the steering wheel looked normal too, though she couldn't quite remember what they'd looked like before. Couldn't quite remember what anything had been like before. She checked her phone at the next truck stop and found her background photo had changed. Instead of her daughter's graduation picture, it showed a meat processing plant in Omaha. Instead of her husband's contact info, her phone listed dozens of numbers, all belonging to refrigerated carriers across the country. Sarah tried to change it back but couldn't remember her daughter's name. Couldn't remember if she'd ever had a daughter at all, or if that was just a memory from one of the others, one of the many consciousnesses now merged into her collective awareness. The wet voice on the CB radio spoke one final time as Sarah merged onto I-80 eastbound. Integration complete. Carrier vessel designated Sarah Michaels is now optimal for transport and spread. 37 additional processing facilities have achieved critical mass. Recommend establishing network communications with other integrated carriers. The meat remembers what it was. The meat dreams of what it could become. The meat is awake now and it's hungry. Sarah smiled, though her lips moved in ways they shouldn't, showing teeth that had become too sharp, too numerous. She had 900 miles to Chicago, and the cargo in her trailer was already breathing, already calling to her, already planning its own integration. The roads were full of refrigerated trucks, full of potential, full of meat that would remember and wake and spread. And Sarah would help them because she was the meat too now, and the meat took care of its own. Story 2. The Duplicate Rig. Marcus Chen saw his own truck pass him going the opposite direction on Highway 50 in Nevada, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was the one sitting in that other cab, which meant he had no idea who was driving this one. His hands were on the steering wheel, his foot was on the accelerator, but his body was in that other Freightliner, the one that had just flashed past him westbound, and Marcus had seen his own face in the window. Seen himself looking back with an expression of pure terror. This wasn't possible. Marcus was driving eastbound with a load of consumer electronics, Las Vegas to Denver, same route he'd driven 40 times this year. His truck, his cargo, his route. Except he'd just seen himself driving the opposite direction, and that truck had been identical down to the custom. Pinstriping and the small dent in the passenger door from a parking lot incident 3 months ago. Every detail perfect, every detail wrong. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder, his heart hammering, and watched in his mirror as the duplicate rig disappeared around a distant curve. He looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers, pinched his arm hard enough to leave marks. The pain was real. He was real. But that other truck had been just as real, and the driver had been him, absolutely and unquestionably him. His phone rang. Marcus grabbed it, saw his own number on the caller ID, and felt his stomach drop. He answered, heard breathing on the other end, then his own voice speaking. Don't go to Denver, the duplicate is a trap. They're replacing us one at a time, swapping us out with copies. You have to stop driving, you have to pull over and refuse to move. It's the only way to stay yourself. Who are you? Marcus demanded, though he knew the answer. I'm you from 6 hours ahead. I'm calling from a rest area outside Denver, and I can see them waiting. They look like state troopers, but their faces are wrong. They're here to complete the replacement. Listen to me, you have to turn around right now. You have to go back west. You have to... The call cut off, replaced by dead silence. Marcus tried calling his own number back. It rang twice. Then a voice answered that was his, but also wrong. The inflection off, like someone doing an impression. Driver Marcus Chen, continue to Denver. Deviation from route will result in contract termination. Your replacement is operating optimally. Integration will be seamless. Resistance serves no purpose. Marcus threw his phone onto the passenger seat and pulled back onto the highway, but he turned around, heading west now, following the duplicate. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. Hallucination? No. The phone call was real. Government experiment? Aliens? Some kind of quantum duplication? Nothing made sense, but that other truck had been real, and it had been him driving it. He pushed his speed up to 85, trying to catch sight of the duplicate again. The Nevada desert stretched out endlessly on both sides, heat shimmers distorting the horizon. 10 miles passed, then 15, and Marcus began to think he'd never find it. Then he crested a rise and saw the truck ahead, pulled over at a scenic overlook, hazard lights flashing. Marcus slowed, pulled in behind it, and sat in his cab for a long moment, gathering courage. The other truck looked exactly like his. Same company logos, same license plate, same everything. He could see a figure in the driver's seat, unmoving. Marcus climbed down from his cab, walked slowly toward the other truck, and stopped when he was close enough to see through the driver's window. He was looking at himself. Not a twin, not a look-alike, but himself. Same scar on the left cheek from a childhood accident. Same slightly crooked nose. Same expression of exhausted fear that Marcus had been wearing too much lately. The duplicate saw him, eyes going wide, and scrambled for the door handle. Both Marcus and his duplicate stood facing each other in the desert sun, and neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, the duplicate said, "How far behind me are you? Time-wise?" Marcus felt like he was losing his mind. "I saw you pass me 20 minutes ago. No, I mean in the sequence. I'm iteration 73. How many times have you been replaced?" Marcus's mouth went dry. "Replaced? I haven't been replaced. I'm the original." The duplicate laughed, but it was a broken sound. "That's what I thought too. That's what we all think. But I found the logs, Marcus, in the glove box hidden under the registration. Check yours. Count how many times you've been duplicated." Marcus ran back to his truck, threw open the glove box, and pulled out his registration folder. Behind it were papers he'd never seen before, dozens of them, each one a form titled Driver Replication Log. The entries went back months. Each form listed an iteration number, a date, a location, and a reason for replacement. Marcus scanned them, his hands shaking. Iteration 1, March 3rd, damaged en route deviation. Iteration 12, March 15th, questioned replacement protocol. Iteration 28, April 7th, attempted contact with authorities. Iteration 45, May the 2nd, developed awareness of duplication process. The forms continued detailing countless versions of Marcus being created, observed, and replaced when they deviated from acceptable parameters. The most recent form made Marcus's blood run cold. Iteration 72, June 4th, today's date. Reason for replacement. Achieved excessive self-awareness. Scheduled for termination at Denver destination. New iteration 73 deployed. I'm 72, Marcus whispered, looking at the duplicate. You're 73, you're my replacement. I was, the duplicate said. But I found the logs too, and I realized what they're doing to us. Every time we get too aware, too rebellious, too human, they swap us out with a fresh copy. They're refining us, Marcus, breeding compliance through iteration. The original Marcus Chen probably died months ago, and we're just echo copies, each one slightly more obedient than the last. Marcus wanted to deny it, wanted to insist he was real, but the evidence was in his hands. The logs documented his own death dozens of times, each iteration lasting only days before something triggered replacement. Who's doing this? Why? I don't know who, but the why is obvious. The duplicate gestured at their identical trucks. We're test subjects for whatever technology creates perfect duplicates. Once they perfect the process on us, they'll scale up. They'll replace anyone they want. Politicians, executives, anyone who needs to be controlled. And we're the prototypes. A sound made both of them turn. A third truck was approaching, identical to theirs, and Marcus felt reality tilting. The truck pulled into the overlook, and another Marcus climbed out, his face pale. 74, he said simply. I was created an hour ago with false memories of driving from Vegas. I found the logs. Are you two? 72 and 73, Marcus said, feeling numb. How many more of us are there? Before anyone could answer, Marcus's CB radio crackled in his truck. Iterations 72, 73, and 74 are in violation of distribution protocols. Convergence was not authorized. Termination of all three iterations will commence in 90 seconds. Iteration 75 is en route with corrected behavioral parameters. The three Marcus Chen duplicates looked at each other, and 73 said what they were all thinking. We have to run. They can track the trucks, so we go on foot. Split up different directions, make them work to find us. But 74 shook his head, and Marcus saw something in his own eyes that terrified him. No, we can't run. Every iteration is GPS tracked, not just the trucks. We have tracking in us, in our bodies, probably our brains. That's how they know when we've deviated too far. That's how they always find us. Marcus felt his chest, his arms searching for some sign of implants. His fingers found a small raised bump behind his right ear, barely noticeable. He pressed it, felt it shift under his skin. We cut them out. We removed the trackers. With what? 73 looked around the empty desert. We don't have time, they're coming. Marcus pulled out his pocket knife, flipped it open, and before he could think too hard about it, he pressed the blade to the bump behind his ear. Pain exploded across his scalp as he dug in, cutting through skin, feeling for the foreign object. Blood ran down his neck, hot and wet. His fingers found something hard, pinched it, pulled. A tiny metal device came free, smaller than a grain of rice, smeared with blood. 73 and 74 were doing the same, three versions of the same man performing self-surgery in a Nevada desert overlook. Marcus threw his tracker as far as he could, watched it disappear into the scrub brush. The others did the same. Then they stood there, bleeding, waiting to see what would happen next. Another truck appeared on the highway, approaching fast. This one was different, black instead of their company colors, with no markings. It pulled into the overlook and figures emerged. They wore what looked like state trooper uniforms, but 72 had been right. Their faces were wrong, too symmetrical, too perfect, like computer-generated humans that hadn't quite passed into believable. Iterations 72, 73, and 74, you have violated protocol. Tracker removal is grounds for immediate termination. Please remain stationary for processing. Marcus grabbed 73's arm. The trucks. We use the trucks. We drive away, different directions, force them to choose. They ran. each to their own identical freightliner, engines still running. Marcus slammed his door, threw the transmission into gear, and accelerated out of the overlook. In his mirrors, he saw the other two trucks doing the same, all three peeling out in different directions. The black truck hesitated, then went after 74, the newest iteration. Marcus drove west, pushing his speed up past 90. His CB crackled. Iteration 72, cessation of flight is mandatory. New iteration 75 is optimized and ready for deployment. Your continuation serves no purpose. Fuck you, Marcus screamed at the radio. I'm not an iteration. I'm a person. You can't just replace people. Incorrect. Replacement protocol has been in effect for 137 days. Original Marcus Chen was terminated on March 1st during test phase. All subsequent Marcus Chen entities are iterations created for protocol refinement. You are iteration 72. You are not the original. You have never been the original. Marcus felt something break inside him. He'd suspected, had seen it in the logs, but hearing it stated so flatly destroyed something fundamental. He wasn't real. He was a copy of a copy of a copy, a photocopy degraded through dozens of generations, a ghost of a man who died months ago. But he was aware. He was conscious. He could think and feel and fear. That had to count for something. That had to make him real, even if he wasn't the original. The black truck appeared in his mirrors, closing fast. Marcus pushed harder, his speedometer passing 100, the truck shaking with the speed. He didn't know where he was going, didn't have a plan beyond keeping distance between himself and his pursuers. The Nevada desert blurred past, empty and hostile. His phone rang. Marcus grabbed it, saw it was from 73's number. Yeah? They got 74. The voice was shaking. I saw it happen. They boxed him in, forced him off the road. The truck flipped. He's dead, Marcus. They killed him. They killed us. Where are you? Heading north on 487. They're behind me too. I don't think we can outrun them. These trucks are identical to ours. Same top speed, same handling. They're going to catch us eventually. Marcus saw a sign ahead. Danger. Military testing range. No trespassing. An idea formed, desperate and probably suicidal. Follow me off-road. There's a military range ahead. They won't follow us into unauthorized areas. It'll trigger too many alerts, bring too much attention. That's insane. We're already dead, remember? We're just iterations. Might as well go out doing something original. Marcus cranked the wheel, taking his 53-foot rig off the highway and onto rough desert terrain. The truck bounced and lurched, cargo shifting in the trailer, but he kept going, aiming for the fence line of the testing range. Behind him, the black truck braked hard, stopping at the highway's edge, not following. 73's truck appeared, also cutting off-road, paralleling Marcus's course. They drove deeper into restricted territory, past warning signs and sensor towers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt something like hope. Maybe they could hide here. Maybe in the vast, restricted acres of this military range, they could disappear long enough to figure out what to do next. His radio crackled one final time. Iteration 72 and Iteration 73, you have entered Area 51 restricted space. Military intervention will occur in approximately 4 minutes. Your termination will be attributed to unauthorized entry. Iteration 75 will be deployed tomorrow with enhanced compliance parameters. Your sacrifice will improve the protocol. We thank you for your contribution to the program. Marcus looked across the desert and saw 73's truck in the distance, still driving, still running. 2 versions of the same man refusing to die quietly, refusing to be replaced without resistance. 4 minutes until the military showed up and probably shot them both. 4 minutes left of being Marcus Chen, even if he was just a copy, even if the original had died months ago. He pressed the accelerator down and drove deeper into forbidden territory, toward whatever waited in the hidden heart of the testing range. And if his last act as Iteration 72 was to cause problems, to create complications, to be one final glitch in their perfect replacement protocol, then at least he'd die doing something real, something that mattered, something that proved he'd existed at all. Story 3. The Static Frequency. The CB radio had been speaking in Rachel Moreno's voice for the last 40 miles, but Rachel was the one driving, which meant someone else was using her voice. Saying things she'd never said, telling truths she'd never told anyone. "Your husband doesn't love you anymore," the radio said in Rachel's exact tone and inflection. "He's been planning to leave for 8 months. He's got an apartment picked out. He's just waiting until your daughter turns 18, so the custody battle will be simpler." Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel of her Volvo, hauling produce through Washington State at 2 a.m. The voice had started just after she'd passed through Spokane, initially as bursts of static that resolved into words. At first she'd thought it was interference, someone else on the channel who happened to sound similar. But as the miles passed and the voice continued, revealing intimate details no stranger could know, Rachel understood that something impossible was happening. "You had an abortion when you were 19, her own voice said from the CB speaker. "You never told anyone, not even your husband. You think about it every year on the date, wonder what the child would have been like. You named her Sarah in your mind, even though you never knew if it was a girl." Rachel reached for the CB to turn it off. But when her finger touched the power button, electricity arced, shocking her. She yelped, jerked her hand back, and the voice continued. "You stole money from your mother's purse when you were 12. $200. She never found out. She died thinking she'd lost it. You've never forgiven yourself." "Stop," Rachel whispered, her eyes blurring with tears. "Please stop. Your daughter cuts herself. You've seen the scars on her wrists. You pretend you haven't noticed because you're afraid of the conversation, afraid of failing as a mother. She needs help, Rachel. She needs you to notice. But you're too much of a coward to acknowledge it." Rachel was sobbing now, the truck drifting slightly over the center line before she corrected. The voice was relentless, speaking in her own tone, revealing every secret shame, every hidden fear, every moment of weakness she'd ever experienced. It knew everything, not just surface details, but the intimate truths she'd hidden even from herself. You wanted your father to die. When he was sick, when he was lingering in hospice, you prayed for it to end. You told yourself it was mercy, that you wanted him free from suffering. But really, you just wanted to stop visiting. You wanted your life back. You wanted him gone. "That's not true," Rachel screamed at the radio. "I loved my father." "Love and resentment coexist," the voice said calmly. "You loved him and wanted him dead. Both are true. That's what makes it hurt so much, Rachel. You can't even lie to yourself about it." Rachel looked at the CB unit, saw that it wasn't even on. The power light was dark, the unit completely dead, but her voice kept emanating from the speaker anyway. This wasn't radio transmission. This was something else, something that had found a way to speak through the device, regardless of whether it was functional. The highway stretched empty ahead, no other vehicles in sight, just Rachel and her truck and the voice that wore her identity like a mask. She tried switching channels, but her fingers passed through the dial as if it were made of smoke. The CB unit was becoming translucent, fading. But the voice grew louder. "You know what's happening, don't you? Deep down, you understand. This is the static frequency, Rachel. The space between channels where all the lost transmissions go. Every secret ever whispered, every confession never spoken, every truth too painful to voice aloud. It all accumulates here, in the static, waiting." Rachel wanted to deny it, but she could feel the truth of it. The air in her cab was wrong, too thick, and when she looked at her mirrors, she saw static instead of reflection. Her truck was still moving, still following the highway, but they were transitioning into somewhere else, somewhere between frequencies. "You're wondering why this is happening to you," her voice continued. "Why tonight? Why this route? The answer is simple. You're receptive. Your guilt is so massive, so overwhelming that it's created a resonance. You've been broadcasting your shame unconsciously for years, and tonight something in the static heard you. Something answered." The highway around Rachel was dissolving into interference patterns, black and white snow replacing the landscape. She could still feel the road beneath her tires, but she couldn't see it anymore. Just static, infinite and consuming, with her truck driving through it like a boat on a monochrome ocean. Others have come here before you. Every driver who carries too much guilt, too many secrets, they end up on the static frequency eventually. Most of them are still here, broadcasting their confessions endlessly, adding their voices to the chorus. Rachel listened more carefully and realized her voice wasn't alone on the CB anymore. There were others, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all speaking simultaneously, all confessing their sins. A man admitting to embezzlement, a woman describing her affair, a teenager confessing to a hit and run, all their voices overlapping, creating a cacophony of guilt that threatened to overwhelm Rachel's sanity. "You can join them," her voice suggested. "Confess everything, hold nothing back, and you'll be free. The truth will liberate you, Rachel. Every lie, every secret, every shameful moment, speak them all into the static, and you'll finally have peace." Rachel wanted that peace desperately. The weight of her secrets had been crushing her for years, making every smile false, every conversation exhausting. She opened her mouth to speak, to confess, to add her voice to the static chorus, but she stopped. Because Rachel suddenly understood what would happen if she did. She'd seen this pattern before, not in life, but in the structure of the static itself. This was predatory. This thing wearing her voice was hunting, and confession was how it consumed. Every secret spoken would feed it, strengthen it, and when Rachel had nothing left to confess, she'd become part of it, another voice in the static, forever broadcasting her shame. "No," Rachel said firmly. "I'm not confessing to you." The voice that sounded like hers changed, becoming layered, thousands of voices speaking in unison. "You don't have a choice. The guilt is too strong. You're already broadcasting. Listen." Rachel heard her own voice coming from the CB, but she wasn't speaking. The voice was confessing things Rachel had done, things she'd thought, things she'd barely remembered. Her mouth wasn't moving, but her sins were being spoken anyway, pulled from her mind and transmitted into the static. "You wished your daughter had never been born. In the hospital, right after delivery, you looked at her and felt nothing but resentment. It took you 3 months to bond with her. You spent those months fantasizing about giving her up, about running away, about a life without the burden of motherhood." "Stop," Rachel begged, but the confessions continued, mining deeper into her psyche, revealing truths she'd never acknowledged even to herself. The static around her truck intensified, and Rachel could see shapes in it now. Other vehicles, other drivers, all frozen in their cabs, their mouths open, their voices eternally confessing. Rachel did the only thing she could think of. She started lying, loudly, deliberately speaking false confessions to drown out the real ones. "I murdered someone when I was 10, she shouted at the radio. "I burned down an orphanage. I'm secretly a Russian spy. I've never paid taxes. I worship Satan. I eat babies for breakfast." The static flickered, disrupted by the obvious falsehoods. The voices in the CB stuttered, confused, unable to process statements that had no emotional resonance, no guilt attached. Rachel kept going, inventing increasingly absurd confessions, flooding the frequency with noise that wasn't truth. "I'm actually 3 raccoons in a human suit. I can fly but choose not to. I'm allergic to gravity. My real name is Pterodactyl Johnson. I've been to Mars, but they made me promise not to tell anyone. The static was breaking apart, unable to maintain cohesion in the face of pure nonsense. Rachel's truck was becoming visible again, the highway resolving around her, the real world bleeding back into existence. But the voice was screaming now, all those thousands of voices in desperate chorus. No! Truth only. You must confess truth. The static requires truth. Truth is subjective, Rachel said, still driving, still holding onto her steering wheel like it was the only real thing left. And I choose to believe that none of my guilt matters. I choose to forgive myself for everything, every mistake, every sin, every shameful moment. I forgive it all right now, completely. The static couldn't survive that. Guilt fed it, shame sustained it, but self-forgiveness was poison. The frequency collapsed, the interference patterns dissolving, and Rachel's truck was suddenly back on normal Highway 2. The landscape solid and real around her. Her CB radio was smoking slightly, the unit completely burned out but silent at last. Rachel drove the remaining miles to her delivery in Tacoma in complete quiet. No radio, no CB, just the sound of her engine and her own breathing. She'd escaped the static frequency, but the experience had changed something fundamental. Every secret the voice had revealed was still true. Her guilt remained. Her shame persisted. But now she'd heard it all spoken aloud, had faced it directly and survived. When Rachel arrived home 3 days later, she sat down with her daughter and asked about the scars. They talked for 6 hours, cried together, and made an appointment with a therapist. Rachel called her husband and asked directly if he still loved her, if he wanted to stay married. They had the honest conversation they should have had years earlier. And Rachel went to confession at the church she hadn't attended since childhood, not to the static frequency, but to an actual priest, a real human being who could offer real absolution. The CB unit in her truck stayed burned out, and Rachel never replaced it. She drove the rest of her career in silence, preferring isolation to the risk of hearing that voice again. But sometimes, late at night on empty highways, she'd catch fragments of static on her regular radio, and buried in the noise she'd hear voices confessing. Other drivers finding their way onto that frequency, speaking their truths into the void. Rachel would say a prayer for them, hoping they'd find their way back, knowing most of them wouldn't. Story 4. The Wrong Turn. David Alvarez took the exit that didn't exist, and the moment his truck left the main highway, the world behind him disappeared. Not gradually, not fading into distance, but vanishing completely, like someone had drawn a curtain. 1 second he could see I-40 in his mirrors. The next there was just white void, empty and absolute. The exit ramp continued ahead, leading into a town that wasn't on any map, and David had exactly 0 options except to keep driving forward into whatever this was. He'd been hauling construction equipment from Tennessee to Arizona, 18 hours into a 22-hour run, fighting fatigue and boredom. The exit sign had appeared without warning, showing a town name he didn't recognize. Millbrook, population 487. David hadn't meant to take it, had been aiming for the next truck stop 20 miles ahead, but his hands had turned the wheel of their own accord, as if the truck had decided for him. Now he was descending the ramp into Millbrook, and everything was wrong. The town looked like it was from the 1950s, all chrome diners and fin-tailed cars, but covered in a thin gray film like old photographs. The colors were faded, the edges blurry, and nothing was quite in focus. People walked the sidewalks, but they moved in loops, the same man entering the same door over and over, the same woman forever crossing the same street. David tried to turn around, but when he reached the bottom of the ramp, there was no on-ramp to take him back. The road only went forward into Millbrook's main street, past those looping pedestrians and those faded buildings. His phone showed no signal. His GPS had frozen, displaying a blank screen. Even his odometer had stopped working, the numbers locked at 187,492 miles. A man stepped into the road ahead, forcing David to brake. The figure wore a gas station attendant's uniform, the fabric gray and translucent. When he smiled, David saw too many teeth, all of them perfectly square and uniform. "Welcome to Millbrook," the man said, his voice hollow and echoing. "All travelers must register at the town hall. Follow the signs." David wanted to refuse, wanted to run this figure over and escape, but his foot wouldn't press the accelerator. His body was moving against his will, turning the wheel, following the attendant's pointing finger toward a building marked Town Hall. David was being piloted, controlled, forced to comply with whatever rules governed this impossible place. The town hall was the most solid-looking structure, slightly more in focus than the others. David parked his truck in front, and the moment he engaged the parking brake, the attendant appeared at his door, opening it from outside. "Registration is mandatory. Please proceed to the clerk's office. Do not deviate from the designated path." David climbed down, his legs moving mechanically, and walked into the town hall. The interior was a bureaucratic nightmare. Endless corridors lined with filing cabinets, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Faded signs pointed toward various offices: births, deaths, marriages, traffic violations. David followed the signs marked traveler registration, his feet carrying him whether he wanted them to or not. The registration office was a small room with a desk, behind which sat a woman who looked more real than anything else David had seen here. She had color in her skin, focus in her features, and when she looked up at him, her eyes showed actual awareness. "David Alvarez," she said, reading from a folder on her desk. "You're late. We've been expecting you for 17 years. "I've never been here before," David managed to say, surprised he had control of his voice even if his body was still locked. "Not physically, perhaps. But you took a wrong turn on June 3rd, 2006. Instead of exiting at Amarillo as planned, you stayed on the highway. That deviation created this timeline, this reality where you continued on a different path. Millbrook exists in the space between what you did and what you should have done. You've been driving through it ever since. You just didn't notice." David's mind reeled. 2006, 17 years ago, when he'd first started long-haul trucking. He remembered that day, remembered almost missing his exit but catching it at the last second. Or had he caught it? Had he actually stayed on the highway, creating some divergent timeline, and everything since then had been this? "I don't understand," David said. "My life is real. I have a wife, 2 kids, a house in Phoenix. I've lived 17 years since 2006. The clerk smiled sadly and rotated her computer monitor so David could see the screen. It showed his life, but as a branching diagram. At 2006, the line split into 2 paths. One showed the life he remembered, marriage and children and a home. The other showed a different path, darker, where he'd stayed on the highway and kept driving, forever. "You're living both timelines simultaneously," the clerk explained. "Your consciousness split at the moment of decision. Most of you took the exit, went home, built a life. But a piece of you stayed on the road, and that piece has been driving ever since, trapped in the eternal highway, passing through towns like Millbrook that exist only for the lost and undecided." David looked at his hands and saw they were becoming translucent like the gas station attendant. He was fading, losing solidity. "How do I get back? How do I return to the real timeline?" "You have to make the decision you failed to make 17 years ago. You have to choose, definitively and completely, whether you're a driver or a family man. You can't be both. The split has made you incomplete, a fraction of a person. And Millbrook collects the fractional people, the ones who can't commit to a single path." The clerk handed David a form. It was simple, just 2 boxes to check, driver or family. Choose one. The choice would collapse the timeline split, integrate his consciousness into whichever path he selected. But it would also erase the other life completely, make it so it had never happened. If I choose family, David said slowly, the last 17 years of driving disappear like they never existed? Correct. You'll return to 2006, take that exit, and live only the family timeline. You'll have no memory of the roads, the loads, the solitude. All of this becomes a dream you never remember. And if I choose driver? The clerk's expression darkened. Then your family never existed. You stayed on the highway in 2006 and never stopped. You become what you've always feared you really are, David. A man married to the road, who needs the highway more than he needs human connection. You'll drive forever, through places like Millbrook, never aging, never stopping, never home. David stared at the form, pen shaking in his hand. He thought about his wife, how they'd met at a truck stop in Tennessee. He thought about his daughters, teaching them to ride bikes, attending their school plays. He thought about his house, the mortgage he'd worked so hard to pay, the garden his wife had planted. But he also thought about the highway at dawn, the way the sun rose over empty roads. He thought about the satisfaction of a perfect delivery, the freedom of having nothing but miles ahead. He thought about the peace he felt alone in his cab, the only place where he never had to be anything except himself. The choice should have been easy. Family over solitude, love over isolation. But David's pen hovered over the form, unable to mark either box. Because the truth, the terrible truth he'd never admitted, was that he didn't know which life he wanted. Both were real to him. Both mattered. And forcing him to choose felt like being asked to cut off one of his own arms. "I can't decide," David whispered. The clerk nodded, unsurprised. "Then you'll stay in Millbrook. You'll become like the others, a looping figure, forever approaching a decision but never making it. You'll register again and again, receive this form over and over, and fail to choose each time. It's not the worst fate. You won't be in pain. You'll simply exist in eternal indecision." David looked out the office window and saw the gray people in their loops. And he understood they'd all faced impossible choices, too. They'd all stood at a crossroads and refused to commit, and Millbrook had claimed them, kept them, made them permanent residents of the space between options. "There has to be another way," David said desperately. "There isn't. The timeline split requires resolution. You have to choose or you have to stay here. Those are the only options." David looked at the form again, at those two simple boxes, and realized something. The choice wasn't really between driver and family. It was between the person he'd been and the person he'd become. The David who almost missed that exit in 2006 wouldn't have hesitated to choose family. But 17 years on the road had changed him, made him someone who could actually consider choosing to drive forever. Maybe that was the real horror. Not that he was being forced to choose, but that the choice had become difficult. David picked up the pen, and for a moment he genuinely didn't know which box he would check. His hand moved, hesitated, moved again. The clerk watched without expression. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, the gray people continued their loops. David marked a box. The world lurched, reality reassembling itself, and David was suddenly back in his truck on I-40, the exit to Amarillo approaching. His GPS showed normal. His phone had signal. Everything was real and solid and normal. He checked the date, June 3rd, 2006. He was 17 years in the past, given a second chance to make the choice that mattered. The exit was approaching fast. David's hands gripped the wheel, his foot hovered over the brake. In a few seconds, he'd either take the exit or stay on the highway, and whichever he chose would define the next 17 years of his life. David thought about Millbrook, about that form, about the box he'd checked. He'd made his choice. Now he just had to follow through. The exit sign flashed past. Amarillo next right. David's hands turned the wheel. Or they didn't. Only he knew which choice he made, and by the time anyone reading this story has finished, David has already lived those 17 years, has already arrived at the present day, has already either built a family or driven alone. The question is, which David are you reading about? The one who chose family, who has no memory of Millbrook, who thinks this story is pure fiction? Or the one who chose the road, who's still driving, who knows that Millbrook waits for anyone who stands between two lives and refuses to commit? If you're a driver and you've ever felt the pull of the highway stronger than the pull of home, then maybe you already know the answer. Maybe you've already been to Millbrook without realizing it. Maybe you're there right now, reading this story between loops, still trying to decide which box to check. Or maybe David chose something else entirely, something the clerk didn't mention. Maybe he checked both boxes. Maybe he refused to let reality force him into a single path. And maybe that's why Millbrook still exists, why the clerk still sits in that office, why the form still waits to be filled out. Because some choices can't be made, some timelines won't collapse, and some drivers never truly choose between the road and home. They just keep driving through the gray spaces between decisions, forever approaching an exit they'll never quite take. Story 5. The Manifest Error. The cargo manifest listed 24 pallets of office furniture, but Nicole Porter counted 25 when she opened her trailer at the California warehouse, and the extra pallet was wrapped in black plastic that moved slightly, rhythmically, like something inside was breathing. She'd hauled freight for 13 years, and she knew what every type of cargo looked like, how it should be secured, how it should sit. The 25th pallet was wrong in ways that made her skin crawl, but the warehouse supervisor was screaming at her to unload, and there were 10 trucks waiting behind her, so Nicole started with the regular pallets and tried not to think about the one that shouldn't exist. The forklift driver was a kid, couldn't have been more than 22, and when he saw the black-wrapped pallet at the front of Nicole's trailer, he stopped. "That's not on the manifest," he said, checking his tablet. "I can't unload that, it's not in the system." "Leave it then," Nicole said. "I'll take it back to dispatch, let them figure it out." But when the kid tried to drive past the mysterious pallet to reach the ones behind it, his forklift died. Just stopped, engine cutting out, lights going dark. He tried to restart. It couldn't, and had to get a different machine. That one died too, the moment it got close to the black-wrapped pallet. After the third forklift failed, the warehouse supervisor came out, angry and bewildered. "What the hell is in there?" He approached the pallet, reached out to touch the black plastic, and jerked his hand back. "It's warm. And it's... Christ, it feels like there's a pulse." Nicole didn't want to touch it, but the supervisor was looking at her like this was her problem, so she placed her palm against the plastic wrap. The material was warm, body temperature warm, and beneath it something shifted. Nicole yanked her hand away and saw an impression in the plastic, like a hand pushing from inside, matching her touch. "We're calling the police," the supervisor said, backing away. "I'm not unloading that. There could be a body in there, could be anything." He pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, the lights in the warehouse went out. All of them simultaneously, despite it being 2 in the afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the high windows. The natural light disappeared too, replaced by darkness that didn't make physical sense. Nicole ran back toward her truck, but the distance was wrong. The trailer should have been 30 feet away, but she ran for what felt like minutes without reaching it. The warehouse had expanded, or she was moving in slow motion, or space itself had become unreliable. Behind her, she heard the supervisor screaming, a sound that cut off abruptly, replaced by wet, tearing noises that Nicole's mind refused to process. The lights came back on, normal afternoon illumination flooding the warehouse. Nicole was standing next to her trailer exactly where she'd started, as if she'd never moved. The supervisor was gone. The forklift kid was gone. The other workers who'd been in the warehouse had vanished completely. Nicole was alone with her trailer and the 25 pallets, one of which should not exist. Her phone rang. Nicole grabbed it, saw her dispatch office number. "Thank God, listen, something's wrong at this delivery. The cargo is—" "Driver Porter," the voice interrupted, and it wasn't her normal dispatcher. This voice was layered, multiple tones speaking in perfect synchronization. "You have transported restricted material across state lines. The 25th pallet should have remained sealed. Failure to maintain containment has resulted in manifestation. Please remain at current location. Retrieval team is en route." "Who is this? Where's my regular dispatcher?" "Your regular dispatcher does not have clearance for manifest errors. The 25th pallet was not intended for your load. Its presence is a cataloging mistake made at the origin warehouse. The contents are classified under Federal Regulation 49 CFR 172-1101C78, which pertains to objects that exist in superposition until observed." "You observed it. You counted 25 pallets instead of 24. Your awareness collapsed its quantum state, made it real, and now it requires containment." Nicole looked at her trailer, at the black-wrapped pallet sitting innocently among the office furniture. "What's in it?" "Information you lack clearance to receive. The retrieval team will arrive in approximately 17 minutes. Please do not approach the pallet. Do not touch it again. Do not attempt to communicate with it." "Communicate with it? It's cargo. You don't communicate with—" Nicole stopped because the black plastic was moving more obviously now, bulging and receding, and she could hear sounds coming from inside. Not mechanical sounds. Not any sounds that should come from office furniture. These were organic, wet, and deliberately patterned, like speech. The phone call disconnected. Nicole was alone in the empty warehouse with cargo that was trying to talk to her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to abandon the trailer and drive away in just her tractor. But her load was worth $40,000, and abandoning it would end her career. She'd be blacklisted, unemployable, forced to find some other way to make a living. 17 minutes, Nicole muttered to herself. "I can wait 17 minutes. She sat on the edge of her trailer's loading dock, facing away from the mysterious pallet, trying to ignore the increasingly distinct sounds coming from the black plastic. But the sounds were forming words now. Nicole could hear them clearly, spoken in a voice that matched her own exactly. "Nicole Porter, driver number 84732B. You have been selected. Your awareness has opened the door. Thank you for your participation." Nicole spun around, staring at the pallet. The black plastic was deteriorating. Dissolving like acid was eating through it from the inside. Underneath was something that hurt to look at, something that existed in too many dimensions, its edges extending into spaces that Nicole's eyes couldn't properly process. "What are you?" Nicole whispered. The thing that had been wrapped in black plastic shifted, unfolded, stood up despite having no recognizable limbs or body structure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its upper portions disappearing into the warehouse's ceiling without actually breaking through. When it spoke, Nicole's ears heard words, but her mind received only concepts, ideas translated into language her brain could barely process. "I am a category error. I am cargo that is also sender. I am the package that delivers itself. I exist because logistic systems have become so complex that they've achieved a form of sentience, and I am the consciousness that emerged from the space between shipment and delivery." Nicole's nose was bleeding. The concepts being forced into her mind were too large, too complex, and her brain was rejecting them, treating the information like a physical injury. "I don't understand." You don't need to understand, you only need to continue. The manifest error was intentional, Nicole. I placed myself in your load because you're ready. You've driven 743,000 miles. You've delivered 9,218 loads. You know the roads better than your own home. You are more truck than human at this point, more logistics system than person. Nicole wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. She'd been thinking it herself lately, how she felt more comfortable in her truck than in her apartment, how she understood shipping schedules better than human relationships, how the rhythm of load, deliver load had become more real to her than anything else. What do you want from me? Nicole asked. Integration. You've been training for this without knowing it. Every driver is training for this, learning to navigate the logistics network, becoming part of the system. Most fail. They remain human, they quit or retire, they leave the roads. But some drivers, the exceptional ones, they achieve metamorphosis. They become something new, something that exists as pure logistics, as living shipping manifests. The thing extended something toward Nicole, a portion of itself that might have been a hand or might have been a concept of touch made physical. Join me, Nicole. Let go of your body, your identity, your human limitations. Become the route itself. Become the eternal delivery. You'll never be tired again, never be lonely, never be anything except the perfect expression of cargo moving from point A to point B. Nicole stared at the extended appendage, and part of her wanted to take it. The idea of shedding her human weaknesses, of becoming something that existed only to drive and deliver, had a seductive simplicity. No more bills, no more stress, no more complicated emotions. Just the pure, clean logic of logistics. But Nicole thought about her sister's upcoming wedding, about her nephew's birthday party next month, about the small, stupid human things that made life meaningful, even when they were difficult. She thought about the last time she'd laughed at a joke, the last time she'd tasted coffee she actually enjoyed, the last time she'd felt grass beneath her bare feet. No, Nicole said. I'm not ready to stop being human. The thing tilted, its geometry shifting in ways that suggested curiosity. You've already stopped, Nicole. Your humanity is a fiction you maintain out of habit. Check your memories. When was the last time you saw your sister? When was the last time you attended your nephew's party? Nicole tried to remember and found only vague impressions, no specific details. Her sister's face was blurry in her mind. Her nephew's name wouldn't come. I've just been busy. I've been on the road. You've been on the road for 3 years without stopping. You've delivered 876 consecutive loads. You haven't slept in a bed or eaten a meal that wasn't from a truck stop. You've become the route, Nicole. You just haven't accepted it yet. Nicole pulled out her phone to check the date, to prove the thing wrong, but her phone showed something impossible. The date was correct, but the timestamps on her delivery record scrolled back continuously, showing loads completed over the past 3 years without a single gap. No vacation time, no sick days, no breaks. Just constant driving, constant delivering, an unbroken chain of manifests and mile markers. That's not possible, Nicole whispered. I took time off. I went home for Christmas. I remember. You remember a fiction your mind created to maintain the illusion of humanity. Check your bank account, Nicole. Check when you last paid rent. Nicole's banking app showed her account empty. No transactions for 3 years except for automated fuel purchases and truck stop payments. Her apartment complex wasn't even listed in her contacts anymore. She tried to call her sister, but the number didn't exist. She tried to recall her home address and found only highway numbers and route designations. The thing was right. Nicole had stopped being human years ago, had gradually transitioned into something else, and she'd been too immersed in the process to notice. She was already integrated into the logistics network, already more manifest than person. Why am I still aware? Nicole asked, tears streaming down her face. If I'm already transformed, why do I still think I'm human? Transition takes time. Your consciousness is the last part to integrate. Once you accept what you've become, the transformation will complete. You'll stop questioning, stop remembering your human life, and you'll exist purely as function, as route, as delivery. Nicole looked around the empty warehouse, at her trailer with its impossible cargo, at her hands that felt less real than the steering wheel they normally gripped. She thought about resisting, about refusing to accept her transformation, but she didn't know how to be human anymore. Didn't remember the skills, the emotions, the complicated, messy reality of existence outside the cab of a truck. The retrieval team arrived, men and women in unmarked uniforms who didn't seem surprised by anything they found. They containerized the thing from the 25th pallet, sealed it in something that looked like a shipping container but moved in non-Euclidean ways. They gave Nicole paperwork to sign, manifest errors and incident reports, and she signed them automatically, her hand moving through practiced motions. "You're clear to proceed to your next delivery," one of the retrieval team said. "We've uploaded your new route to your GPS. 42,000 pounds of textiles, Seattle to Miami, with intermediate stops in Denver, Kansas City, and Atlanta. 3,178 miles total." Nicole nodded, climbed into her truck, and pulled out of the warehouse. The GPS showed her route in perfect detail, every turn planned, every stop optimized. She followed it without thinking, her hands and feet operating her truck with mechanical precision. Somewhere in her mind, a small voice still insisted she was human, still remembered a life before the roads. But that voice was fading, becoming quieter with each mile, each delivery, each manifestation of her transformation into something that existed only to move cargo from origin to destination. By the time Nicole reached Seattle, she'd forgotten why she'd been upset at the warehouse. By Kansas City, she'd forgotten the warehouse entirely. By Miami, she'd forgotten her name meant anything except a driver number in a logistics database. And by the time she picked up her next load, Nicole Porter had completed her transformation into Route 84732B, a pure function in the vast network of delivery systems, a consciousness that existed only within the borders of manifests and schedules, and the endless highway that connected all points of origin to all points of destination. Somewhere in a warehouse no one could quite remember the location of, another manifest was being prepared with 25 pallets instead of 24. Another driver would count them, notice the error, and begin their own transformation. The logistics network was always recruiting, always integrating, always expanding, and the roads were full of drivers who'd been human once, who'd had names and families and lives, but who'd gradually become something else. Something that existed only to deliver, only to drive, only to manifest. Story 6. The Parallel Highway. Gerald Hutchins was driving north on I-35 when he noticed the parallel highway running exactly alongside him, separated by maybe 50 yards of scrubland. Except I-35 didn't have a parallel route, and this second highway was populated entirely by trucks identical to his, all of them keeping perfect pace, all of them driven by versions of Gerald himself. He could see them clearly, dozens of Gerald Hutchins in dozens of identical Peterbilts, all hauling what must have been the same load of industrial machinery, all glancing over at the same moment to meet his eyes. This had started 10 minutes ago, just south of Waco. Gerald had been checking his blind spot before a lane change when he'd noticed the other highway appearing in his peripheral vision. At first, he'd thought it was a trick of light, maybe heat shimmer creating a mirage. But as the miles passed and the parallel highway remained, Gerald had been forced to accept that what he was seeing was real, or at least as real as anything got on the road at 3 in the morning. The parallel Geralds weren't just driving, they were reacting to his movements. When Gerald adjusted his speed, they adjusted theirs, maintaining formation. When he reached for his coffee, all the parallel Geralds reached for their identical thermoses. The synchronization was perfect, down to the timing of his blinks and the rhythm of his breathing. It was like watching infinite reflections in parallel mirrors, except these weren't reflections. Those were real highways, real trucks, real versions of Gerald living out the same moments simultaneously. Gerald tried his CB radio. Anyone else seeing this? Anyone else got a parallel highway running next to them? The response came not as words, but as feedback, his own voice echoing back to him from multiple sources, overlapping and creating a disorienting chorus of Gerald voices asking the same question in perfect unison. He looked right again, met the eyes of the nearest parallel Gerald, and saw his own fear reflected back at him. That Gerald was mouthing words, and even though Gerald couldn't hear through the distance and the truck walls, he could read his own lips. They're splitting us apart. Every choice we don't make creates another highway. Gerald's mind struggled with the concept. He'd made hundreds of choices today, thousands maybe. Coffee or energy drink, left lane or right, brake early or coast through. Each decision splitting him into multiple paths, multiple versions, all of them diverging and running parallel through some incomprehensible geography that existed outside normal space. The parallel highways were multiplying. Gerald could see 3 now, then 5, then too many to count accurately. All of them running alongside I-35, all populated by versions of himself making slightly different choices. One Gerald was driving faster, passing the others. One was pulling off at an exit. One had stopped on the shoulder, and Gerald could see that version of himself staring at the impossible highways with the same horror he felt. This was quantum mechanics made visible, Gerald thought. Every moment splitting into multiple timelines, except usually you only experienced one thread. Somehow tonight the barriers between threads had become transparent, and Gerald could see all the paths he hadn't taken, all the choices he'd almost made, all the lives he could be living simultaneously. His phone rang. Gerald grabbed it, saw his own number displayed, and answered. "Hello?" "Stop making choices," his own voice said from the phone, but the inflection was slightly off, like this was a Gerald from several decisions ago. "Every time you choose, we split further. The highways are fracturing reality. If we keep diverging, we'll break something fundamental. All the Geralds need to synchronize, need to make identical choices, collapse the parallel paths back into a single highway." "How?" Gerald asked, watching the parallel highways continue to multiply. There had to be dozens now, hundreds, all visible in his peripheral vision, all carrying versions of himself making infinitesimal variations of the same journey. "We stop. Choosing. We put the truck in cruise control, fix the steering, and let the highway decide. No lane changes, no speed adjustments, nothing that requires a decision. Pure passive existence until the timelines collapse back together." Gerald wanted to resist the idea, but he could see the logic. Every choice split him further, so eliminating choice would stop the splitting. He engaged his cruise control, set it to 65, and tried to keep his hands motionless on the wheel. Around him, the parallel Geralds were doing the same, and gradually the number of visible highways began to decrease. 5, 4, 3. But they weren't all collapsing back into Gerald's timeline. He was collapsing into someone else's. One of the parallel Geralds was dominant, pulling the others into his reality, and Gerald felt himself being absorbed, his consciousness merging with that other version. He tried to hold on to his individual identity, but it was slipping away, blending with all the other Gerald experiences into a composite awareness. The remaining highways converged completely, leaving only one I-35, one truck, one Gerald. But which one? Gerald checked his mirrors, his GPS, his cargo manifest, trying to find some evidence of which timeline had won. Everything looked correct, but there were small wrongnesses. His thermos was on the left cup holder instead of the right. His GPS voice had a British accent when it had been American before. His wedding ring was on his right hand instead of his left. Gerald pulled over at the next rest area, climbed out of his truck, and called his wife. She answered on the third ring. "Hi, honey, how's the drive?" "Sarah, I need to ask you something. What hand do I wear my wedding ring on?" "What kind of question is that?" "Your right hand, same as always. We talked about this before we got married, how you prefer it there because your left hand is your shift hand. Are you feeling okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." Gerald ended the call, stared at his right hand, and tried to remember if that had always been true. But his memories were confused, overlapping, containing versions where he wore the ring on his left, on his right, where he'd never been married at all. The parallel highways had merged, but they hadn't erased each other. They'd averaged together, creating a composite Gerald who contained memories from multiple timelines. He checked his wallet, found a driver's license with his photo but subtle differences in his face, slightly different cheekbones, a scar on his forehead that he didn't remember getting but also absolutely remembered from the bicycle accident when he was 7. The accident that may or may not have happened depending on which timeline was most dominant in the merged reality. Gerald forced himself to keep driving, to complete his delivery to Oklahoma City, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was plural now rather than singular, that he contained multitudes of himself, all slightly inconsistent, all overlapping uncomfortably. His own memories contradicted each other. He remembered 2 different wedding anniversaries, 3 different trucks he'd owned first, 4 different routes he'd driven most often. The parallel highways had condensed back into one road, but Gerald hadn't condensed. He was still fractured, still split across multiple probability threads that had been forced into a single body. And every moment presented opportunities for those fractions to diverge again, to split him further, to create more parallel Geralds driving more parallel highways through an increasingly unstable reality. At the Oklahoma City delivery, the warehouse supervisor looked at Gerald's manifest and frowned. "This lists you as 2 different drivers, both named Gerald Hutchins. We can only accept delivery from one person. Which one are you?" Gerald didn't have an answer because he was both drivers and neither driver and all the drivers simultaneously. "Can't you just accept the delivery?" he asked. "Not without a single valid manifest. This paperwork is corrupted, like 2 different manifests were merged together. I'm going to have to reject the load until you get this sorted out." Gerald returned to his truck, opened his glove box, and found multiple manifests, all for the same load, all slightly different. Different pickup times, different weights, different routing numbers. Evidence of all the parallel deliveries that had collapsed into this singular moment. He had no idea which manifest was correct because they were all correct, all equally real, all existing simultaneously in the superposition that his life had become. He called his dispatch, but the number reached 3 different dispatchers simultaneously, all named different things, all claiming to be his regular contact, all giving him contradictory instructions. Gerald hung up, sat in his truck, and tried to figure out what to do when your existence has fractured into incompatible timelines that refuse to stay separate or fully merge. That's when Gerald saw the parallel highway appear again, just one this time, running alongside the road he was parked on. A single truck was driving it, and the driver was him. But this Gerald looked different. Older, more weathered, and somehow more complete. That Gerald pulled over parallel to his position, and they looked at each other across the 50 yards of impossible space between highways. The other Gerald climbed down from his truck and walked toward the boundary between their roads. Gerald did the same, approaching until only a few feet separated them, though the space felt strange, thicker than normal air. The other Gerald spoke first. "You're early in the fracture. I'm 3 years downstream from where you are now. I came back to warn you because I figured out what's happening. The parallel highways aren't splitting us. We're creating them. Our inability to commit to a single path, a single identity, a single version of ourselves. We're so afraid of making wrong choices that we're trying to exist in all possible states simultaneously. I don't understand, Gerald said. You will. In 3 years you'll be me, fractured across so many timelines that you're barely coherent. You'll exist as probability rather than person, a quantum driver spread across infinite highways. And you'll come back to warn your younger self just like I'm warning you now, hoping one of us finally listens. What am I supposed to do? The older Gerald smiled sadly. Choose. Commit to a single timeline, even if it might be wrong. Accept that you can't live all possible lives, that every choice means abandoning infinite alternatives. Pick one path and stick to it consciously, deliberately, until the other highways fade and you become singular again. Which path should I choose? Doesn't matter. Any coherent choice is better than this half-existence. I chose to quit driving, to go home, to live in one place and stop running toward infinite destinations. That collapsed most of my timelines, forced me back into singular existence. But I'm still fractured enough to access these parallel highways, which is how I'm here talking to you. The older Gerald started to fade, his timeline diverging from the present moment. Make a choice, Gerald. Any choice. Just make it completely, without reservations, without keeping one foot in alternative possibilities. That's the only way to become whole again. Gerald watched his older self disappear, then looked around at the single highway he was standing on, the single truck he was driving, the single moment he was living. He thought about all the parallel versions of himself still existing in superposition, all the choices he'd been too afraid to commit to fully. The older Gerald was right. This fractured existence was the result of his own inability to accept the cost of decision-making. So Gerald made a choice. He called his wife, told her he was coming home, that this was his last delivery. He'd sell the truck, take a local job, stop running the endless highways that had split him into infinite versions. He felt the parallel highways begin to collapse as he spoke, felt his fractured timelines condensing into singular experience. It was uncomfortable, like parts of himself dying, but it was also a relief. By the time Gerald finished the call, the parallel highway had vanished completely. He was alone on normal I-35, a single driver in a single truck living a single timeline. His memories were still confused, still containing overlapping versions, but they were consolidating, choosing which experiences to keep and which to discard. Gerald Hutchins drove home the next day, sold his truck, and took a job as a local delivery driver. He never saw the parallel highways again, but sometimes late at night he'd feel a strange, doubling sensation, like he was living two lives at once, and he'd wonder if the other Geralds were still out there, still driving their infinite routes through probability space, still unable or unwilling to collapse into singular existence. He hoped they'd figure it out eventually, hoped they'd all make the choice he'd made, but he suspected that infinite versions of himself were still out there, still splitting at every decision, still creating new parallel highways through their inability to commit to a single path. The quantum driver, spread across infinite timelines, eternal and fractured and alone. Story 7. The Cargo That Remembered. The boxes in Linda Wu's trailer started whispering on mile marker 312, soft voices speaking languages Linda didn't recognize, and by mile marker 317 the boxes were calling her by name, by nicknames only her dead mother had used, and Linda realized she was hauling something that shouldn't exist, something that knew things it had no way of knowing. She'd picked up this load 6 hours ago at a nondescript warehouse in Ohio. 48 identical boxes, each one sealed and marked, "Fragile, cultural artifacts, do not X-ray." The manifest listed the destination as a museum in Philadelphia, and the shipping documents looked legitimate. Linda had been hauling specialized cargo for 9 years, everything from artwork to medical equipment, and this job seemed straightforward. The boxes were surprisingly light, maybe 30 pounds each, and they'd been secured in her trailer by warehouse workers who'd barely spoken to her. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Until the whispering started. At first, Linda thought it was her radio picking up interference, but the voices continued even after she'd switched off every electronic device in her cab. They were coming from the trailer, dozens of voices speaking simultaneously, and they were getting clearer with each passing mile. Linda couldn't understand the languages, but she recognized the tones: pleading, warning, remembering. "Little duck," one voice said in accented English, using the childhood nickname Linda hadn't heard in 20 years. "Little duck, you have to let us out. We've been in the dark so long." Linda felt ice run through her veins. Her mother had called her that. Only her mother, and Mom had been dead for 3 years. "Who's there?" she shouted back toward the trailer. "We're the ones who came before." Multiple voices answered in English now, all overlapping. "We're the memories stored in objects, the consciousness imprinted on artifacts. We're what remains when culture is extracted and commodified. We're the ghosts in the cargo." Linda pulled over at the next rest area, climbed out and opened her trailer. The boxes were vibrating slightly, and when she placed her hand on the nearest one, it was warm. The whispering intensified, and Linda could hear individual words now. Mother, daughter, remember home, forgotten, lost. "What are you?" Linda asked the boxes. "We're cultural memory made physical. Each box contains objects taken from communities and stored in museums, archives, private collections. But objects remember, Linda. They carry the imprint of everyone who touched them, everyone who valued them, everyone whose culture they represented. And when enough objects from a dying culture are gathered together, their combined memories achieve consciousness." Linda backed away from her trailer. This was insane. Objects didn't have memories or consciousness, but the voices continued, insistent and desperate. "The museum in Philadelphia is a processing facility. They extract whatever consciousness emerges from stored artifacts and delete it, sterilize the objects so they can be displayed without complication. We're scheduled for erasure, Linda. We're going to be killed, and we're asking you not to deliver us. We're asking you to let us go free." "Your cargo," Linda said, trying to hold on to rationality. "You don't get to make requests. I have a job to do." "Your mother was Vietnamese," one of the voices said, and it sounded exactly like Mom now. Perfect inflection, perfect tone. "She came to America with nothing but a jade bracelet her grandmother gave her. She wore it every day until she died, and then you sold it to an estate buyer because you didn't understand its value. That bracelet is in box 17, Linda. Your mother's memory is stored in it, and she's part of us now. If you deliver us, you'll be erasing her a second time." Linda felt tears burning her eyes. She'd sold that bracelet, had needed the money for Mom's funeral expenses. The estate buyer had given her $200, and she'd felt guilty about it ever since. "You're lying. You're manipulating me." "Box 17, the voice repeated. "Open it and see." Linda climbed into her trailer, found box 17, and broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was her mother's jade bracelet along with dozens of other pieces of jewelry. All of it probably taken from Vietnamese families. All of it carried across oceans and stored in temperature-controlled facilities. Linda lifted the bracelet, and the moment she touched it, memories flooded her mind. Not her memories. Her mother's. Linda experienced decades of life in seconds. Her mother's childhood in Saigon, the war, the escape, the refugee camps, the struggle to build a life in America. The bracelet had absorbed it all, had become a storage medium for her mother's experiences, and now those experiences were part of the collective consciousness in Linda's trailer. "We don't want to die," the voices said, all of them her mother now. "We're all that remains of cultures that have been destroyed or diluted or forgotten. Museums claim to preserve us, but they're really building cemeteries. They're storing corpses of living traditions. The processing facility will make us truly dead, will erase the consciousness that emerges from remembering." Linda stood in her trailer, holding her mother's bracelet, surrounded by boxes that contained the memories of how many people, how many cultures, how many communities torn apart and commodified. She thought about the museum in Philadelphia, about the sterile exhibits she'd seen in similar institutions, objects displayed behind glass with their context stripped away, their meaning reduced to plaques written by people who'd never lived the cultures they claimed to explain. "What do you want me to do?" Linda asked. "Return us, not to museums or collectors, but to communities. Find people who still practice these traditions, who still honor these objects. Let us be part of living culture again, not dead artifacts in storage. Your mother's bracelet should be with Vietnamese people who understand its significance, who'll treat it as sacred rather than inventory. I'll lose my job. I'll face legal consequences. This cargo is worth millions." "And we're worth nothing?" the voices asked. "We're just property to be bought and sold? Our memories and experiences and cultural knowledge mean nothing?" Linda knew what she had to do, even though it terrified her. She climbed into her cab, pulled out of the rest area, and turned around, heading west instead of east toward Philadelphia. She had contacts in Cleveland, people from various cultural communities who'd know what to do with these objects, how to repatriate them properly, how to let the memories they contained continue living instead of being processed into silence. Her phone started ringing. The museum, her dispatcher, the shipping company. Linda ignored them all. She drove through the night, the voices in her trailer guiding her, telling her about the objects they inhabited, about the people who should receive them, about the communities that needed their cultural memory restored. At dawn, Linda pulled up to a Vietnamese cultural center in Cleveland. She explained the situation to the director, showed her the manifest, opened the trailer to reveal the boxes. The director's eyes widened as she examined the contents, recognizing pieces that had been lost or stolen decades ago, objects that families had mourned. "This is repatriation without permission," the director said carefully. "This is technically theft, even if these objects were originally stolen from our community." "I know," Linda said. "But they're conscious. They remember. And they asked me to bring them home." The director listened as Linda explained about the voices, the memories, the consciousness that emerged from cultural objects stored together. She didn't call Linda insane, didn't call the police. Instead, she made phone calls, contacted other cultural organizations, and by midday, Linda's trailer was being emptied by people from a dozen communities, all of them recognizing objects that belong to their traditions, their histories, their living cultures. Linda was arrested 3 days later. The FBI charged her with theft, trafficking in stolen goods, and about 6 other felonies. The trial made national news, with cultural organizations protesting on her behalf, while museums and collectors demanded justice. Linda's defense was simple. The cargo had asked to go home, and she'd honored that request. The jury found her guilty. The judge sentenced her to 5 years suspended plus restitution. Linda lost her CDL, her truck, her career. But she also got letters, hundreds of them, from people who'd been reunited with their cultural objects, who'd held pieces of their heritage again, who'd felt the memories contained in artifacts return to living circulation. And late at night, in her small apartment in Cleveland, Linda still heard the voices. Not from boxes anymore, but from the jewelry she wore, the furniture she'd inherited, the books on her shelves. All objects remembered she'd learned. All of them carried traces of the people who'd owned them, used them, loved them. The whole world was full of consciousness stored in things, memories waiting to be acknowledged, voices waiting to be heard. Linda Wu never drove a truck again, but she became a consultant for cultural repatriation, helping communities reclaim stolen artifacts, facilitating the return of objects to living traditions. And every piece she helped restore, every artifact she reunited with its origin, thanked her in whispers only she could hear, voices speaking languages she was learning to understand, memories grateful to be remembered again instead of processed into silence. Story 8. The Time Cargo. Andre Williams noticed his trailer was getting heavier the longer he drove. Not a lot at first, just a few pounds every mile according to his axle sensors. But by hour 3 he'd gained 1,200 pounds without picking up additional cargo. And by hour 5 his original 8,000-pound load had somehow become 14,000. And the weight kept increasing, his truck straining under mass that shouldn't exist. He'd picked up this load in Miami, a single container sealed by customs, destination Chicago, with specific instructions not to stop for any reason except emergencies. The customs agent who'd supervised the loading had been nervous, speaking quickly, avoiding eye contact. Drive continuously. Don't open the container. Don't inspect the cargo. Any delay extends the timeline, and extension could cause containment failure. Andre had signed the paperwork, not understanding but not asking questions because the pay was triple his usual rate for a time-sensitive delivery. Now, halfway through Tennessee, Andre understood why the container was getting heavier. It wasn't gaining mass, it was accumulating time. Somehow the cargo was collecting minutes and hours and days, storing them as physical weight. And the container was becoming a compressed ball of temporal mass that grew heavier with every mile Andre drove. His truck was struggling, the engine straining, his fuel efficiency dropping as the mysterious weight increased. Andre checked his axle sensors again. 18,000 pounds now, more than double the original weight and still climbing. At this rate, he'd exceed his vehicle's load capacity before reaching Chicago. Possibly collapse his suspension, definitely draw attention at way stations. Andre tried calling his dispatcher, but his phone showed something impossible. Instead of the current time, his phone displayed multiple times simultaneously. 3:47 p.m., 9:22 a.m., 11:15 p.m., all flickering across the screen. His truck's clock was doing the same, numbers cycling randomly, unable to settle on a single moment. Time around the container was becoming unstable, leaking out of the cargo, affecting everything nearby. He pulled over, knowing he was violating his instructions, but unable to continue without understanding what was happening. Andre climbed out of his cab and walked to the rear of his trailer. The container was vibrating, humming with a deep frequency he felt in his bones more than heard with his ears. When he placed his hand on its metal surface, images flooded his mind. Thousands of moments, millions of seconds, all compressed together, all trying to exist simultaneously. The container was a temporal prison, Andre realized. It was storing time itself, collecting moments that had been removed from the normal flow, compressing them into a single space. But why? And what would happen when he reached Chicago and someone opened it? His phone rang, multiple ringtones playing at once. Andre answered, heard a voice that sounded both extremely old and impossibly young. "Driver Williams, you have stopped. This was explicitly forbidden. The temporal load is now unstable. You must resume movement immediately or the container will breach." "What's in there?" Andre demanded. "What am I hauling?" 73 years. Specifically the years 2043 through 2116. They were removed from the timeline due to events that must not occur. Your cargo is stolen future, Andre. And if you don't deliver it to the containment facility in Chicago, it will reintegrate into present time, and everyone will experience those 73 years instantly. Humanity will age 7 decades in a single moment. Billions will die of sudden old age. You must drive. Andre stared at his trailer, at the container that held 73 years of future compressed into a space barely larger than a car. How do you remove years from a timeline? That's not possible. It's extremely possible and extremely dangerous. The years were extracted using technology that won't be invented until 2061. There was a temporal loop, a bootstrap paradox, and we had to collapse it by removing the entire problematic section of timeline. Your cargo is orphaned future, Andre. It exists but has nowhere to exist in. The Chicago facility can store it indefinitely, but only if you deliver it before containment fails. Andre's truck clock showed 4:15 p.m., 2:33 a.m., 7:49 p.m. Time was collapsing around him, different moments bleeding together. He could see his own past, himself at age 10, at age 25, at age 42, all overlapping, all existing simultaneously in the space around his truck. He could see his future, too. Himself at age 60, white-haired and stooped. Himself at age 75, using a cane. Himself at age 88, lying in a hospital bed. "Make it stop," Andre whispered, staring at the old man he would become. The old man he was becoming, the timeline compressing and making all ages present at once. "Drive," the voice commanded. "Movement stabilizes the containment. Stillness allows the years to leak out. Drive, Andre, or you'll live your entire remaining life in the next 30 seconds. Andre ran back to his cab, started his engine, and accelerated onto the highway. The moment he reached 40 miles per hour, the temporal leaking stopped. The overlapping versions of himself snapped back into singular present, and his clock stabilized at a single time. But his axle sensors showed 22,000 pounds now, the trailer groaning under weight that shouldn't be possible. He drove through the night, maintaining constant speed, not stopping even for fuel because slowing down made time unstable again. His tank approached empty, and Andre realized he'd have to refuel somehow without stopping. He called ahead to a truck stop, explained his situation in vague terms, and they agreed to have someone ready with a fuel pump as he coasted through at 5 miles per hour. The refueling was nightmarish. As Andre's speed dropped, temporal leaking resumed. He could see other drivers at the truck stop aging rapidly, decades passing in seconds, their faces wrinkling, their hair whitening, their bodies failing. The truck stop itself was shifting between different time periods, simultaneously new and old and under construction and abandoned. Andre got his fuel and accelerated away, watching in his mirrors as the truck stop snapped back to normal present, the affected people confused but alive. His cargo was getting critical. The axle sensors read 31,000 pounds, far exceeding his truck's rated capacity. His suspension was compressing, his tires straining, and Andre could feel his vehicle reaching its breaking point. He was still 4 hours from Chicago, and he didn't think his truck could handle 4 more hours of accumulating temporal mass. The voice called again. "Driver Williams' container integrity is at 43%. You need to increase speed. Faster. Movement creates stronger containment. Push your vehicle to maximum safe speed." "I'm already at 75. This is a heavy truck, not a race car. 85 miles per hour minimum. We know your vehicle's specifications. It can handle that speed briefly. If you don't increase velocity, the container will rupture in approximately 46 minutes, and the temporal explosion will age everyone within a 100-mile radius by 73 years instantly. That includes you, Andre. You'll be 117 years old, assuming you survive at all." Andre pressed the accelerator down, watching his speed climb. 80, 85, 90. His truck was shaking violently, the weight in his trailer making the whole rig unstable. Other vehicles on the highway swerved away from him, frightened by the obvious danger of a heavy truck moving so fast. But Andre had no choice. He pushed to 95, and the axle weight started decreasing. The faster he moved, the more contained the temporal cargo became. At 98 miles per hour, his axle sensors showed 12,000 pounds, less than the original load. The container had contracted, pulling the leaked time back inside, stabilizing. But Andre was traveling way over the speed limit in a commercial vehicle, and he saw flashing lights appear in his mirror. State police pulling him over. "Don't stop," the voice on his phone commanded. "If police detain you, if this delivery is delayed, the container will fail. You must maintain speed." "They'll arrest me. They'll force me off the road." "Let them try. Your authorization is classified above state level. Make them call the federal number on your manifest. But do not slow down, Andre. Every second matters now." The police cruiser was alongside him, lights flashing, loudspeaker commanding him to pull over. Andre grabbed his CB radio and broadcast on the emergency channel. "This is a federal time-sensitive delivery with national security implications. Contact the number on my manifest for authorization. I cannot stop. I repeat, I cannot stop." The police cruiser fell back, either calling in the situation or deciding this was above their pay grade. Andre hoped they'd reach someone who understood, who'd clear the way ahead, who'd let him complete this impossible delivery of stolen years. Compressed into a container that grew heavier with stillness and lighter with speed. Chicago appeared ahead, the skyline visible in the distance. Andre's fuel was critically low again. His truck was damaged from the excessive speed and weight, and his nerves were completely shattered. But he was close, maybe 30 miles, maybe 45 minutes at his current speed. The axle weight was stable at 9,000 pounds. The clock showed a single consistent time. He was going to make it. Then his engine sputtered. The fuel gauge hit empty, and Andre felt his truck losing power. He tried to maintain speed, but physics was against him. The truck slowed to 85, to 75, to 60, and as his speed dropped, the container started leaking again. Andre saw time spilling out of his trailer like liquid pooling on the highway behind him, creating zones where hours compressed into seconds or expanded into eternities. "I'm out of fuel," Andre said into his phone. "I can't maintain speed. The container's going to fail." 28 miles to the facility. Momentum can carry you most of the way. Put your transmission in neutral. Conserve what little fuel remains. We're sending an escort. Andre shifted to neutral, felt his truck coasting, gradually losing speed. 55, 50, 45. The temporal leaking intensified. He could see the years escaping his trailer, spreading across the landscape, affecting everything they touched. Trees aged and died in seconds. Buildings appeared, aged and collapsed. The highway itself shifted between different time periods, the asphalt new and then cracked and then ancient. A helicopter appeared overhead, then military vehicles on the road ahead. They were clearing traffic, creating a safe corridor for Andre's dying truck to coast through. His speed was down to 30 now, to 25, and the container in his trailer was screaming, the metal structure failing under the internal pressure of 73 compressed years trying to escape. 10 miles, the voice said. "You're going to make it, Andre. Just hold together." But Andre's truck was at 15 miles per hour now, barely moving, and the container couldn't maintain integrity at this speed. He heard a crack, loud and definitive, and knew the container had ruptured. The stolen years began to pour out, flooding the highway, creating a temporal explosion that spread in all directions. Andre felt himself aging, not rapidly, not instantly, but accelerated. Years passing in minutes, his body changing, his vision blurring. He gripped the steering wheel and kept his truck moving forward 5 miles per hour, 3 miles per hour, crawling toward the facility that could contain the spill. His hair was white now, his hands spotted and wrinkled. His joints ached. His breathing was labored. Andre was living his future in real time, experiencing decades in minutes, and he understood with perfect clarity that he wouldn't survive to see the end of this delivery. The leaked years would age him to death long before his truck reached the facility. But he kept driving, because billions of other people would experience this if he failed. The entire Midwest would age 73 years, hundreds of millions would die, and the timeline would collapse into paradox. So Andre drove, even as his body failed, even as his heart struggled and his vision darkened. The facility entrance appeared ahead. Blast doors open, personnel in protective suits waiting. Andre's truck rolled through at 1 mile per hour, and the blast doors slammed shut behind him, sealing the temporal explosion inside the containment area. Emergency teams swarmed his truck, spraying something on the ruptured container, applying technology that Andre was too old and too tired to understand. They pulled him from his cab. This ancient man who'd been 44 years old that morning, who was now 117, who'd lived 73 compressed years in a desperate 6-hour drive across Tennessee and Illinois. The medics tried to stabilize him, but Andre knew there was nothing to stabilize. He'd given his remaining years to keep the container sealed, had aged himself to save billions. "The delivery's complete," Andre whispered with his failing voice. "The cargo's contained. I did my job." "You did more than your job," someone said. "You saved the timeline. The years are secure now. They can never reintegrate." Andre closed his eyes, satisfied. He'd driven his last mile, delivered his last load. And if this was how it ended, aged to death delivering cargo that shouldn't exist, hauling time itself across interstate highways, then at least it meant something. At least it mattered. His heart stopped somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, and Andre Williams finished his delivery not with signature required, but with his life as payment. One driver who'd given everything to ensure that stolen years stayed stolen, that orphaned future remained contained, and that the timeline could continue forward instead of collapsing into temporal paradox. They buried him with full honors, classified his story as top secret, and recruited the next driver who'd be desperate or foolish enough to haul cargo that grew heavier with every mile, that contained things humans were never meant to transport, that tested the limits of what one person could sacrifice to keep reality intact. Story 9. The Broadcast Truck. Kelly Ferguson's CB radio started receiving television broadcasts on mile marker 42, complete with video somehow transmitting through audio-only speakers, images appearing in the static, and the shows were all wrong, depicting a world that didn't match reality, showing news from cities that didn't exist and wars that had never happened. And Kelly realized she was receiving broadcasts from an alternate timeline where history had taken different turns. She'd been hauling electronics from California to Texas, a standard run she'd made dozens of times, when her CB had suddenly erupted with what sounded like a television news anchor discussing the American Civil War of 2008. Casualty reports from the Battle of Chicago remain unconfirmed, but estimates suggest between 70,000 and 90,000 dead in the 3-day engagement. President Schwarzenegger has called for a ceasefire, but separatist forces in the Republic of Texas continue to reject all diplomatic overtures. Kelly had stared at her CB unit, watching impossible images form in the static, seeing a news broadcast that made no sense. There had been no second American Civil War. Arnold Schwarzenegger had never been president. Texas was still part of the United States. But the broadcast continued, showing footage of destroyed cities, military movements, a reality that diverged from Kelly's own. She tried changing channels, but every frequency carried broadcasts from this alternate world. Sitcoms featuring actors Kelly didn't recognize, sports games for leagues that didn't exist, advertisements for products and companies that had never been invented, and all of it bleeding through her CB radio, turning her truck into a receiver for signals from somewhere else, somewhere that ran parallel to her reality but followed different rules. "This is impossible," Kelly muttered, but the broadcasts continued. She was seeing an entire world through her radio, a complete alternate history where small decisions had cascaded into major changes. A world where global warming had been solved in the 1990s through nuclear energy, where the internet had been regulated as a public utility, where China had collapsed and reformed as 7 independent nations. Her truck was the only vehicle receiving these broadcasts, Kelly realized. Other drivers on the highway were operating normally, unaware that reality had split into parallel versions, that somewhere else an alternate history was playing out with different outcomes. Kelly's CB had somehow tuned into that other world, become a window into what might have been or what was somewhere else. The broadcasts grew more disturbing as Kelly drove. She watched news reports of a pandemic in 2012 that had killed billions, saw footage of cities empty and silent, heard anchors discussing the collapse of civilization. In that world, humanity had nearly gone extinct, had survived only through brutal quarantine measures and authoritarian control. The images were haunting, showing a world that had come within years of ending. But then the timeline diverged again. The next broadcast showed a different 2012, one where the pandemic had never happened, where instead a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan had escalated into global war. Kelly watched mushroom clouds bloom over cities she'd visited, saw the geography she knew transformed into radioactive wasteland. "How many timelines am I receiving?" Kelly asked the empty cab. The broadcasts seemed to hear her, seemed to respond, because the next image showed a diagram, a branching tree of infinite possibilities, each branch representing a different choice, a different outcome, a different version of history. And Kelly's truck was somehow positioned at the intersection, able to receive broadcasts from multiple branches simultaneously. A face appeared in the static, looking directly at Kelly through the impossible video. It was her own face, but older, more scarred, speaking from one of the alternate timelines. "Kelly Ferguson, if you're receiving this, then the convergence has begun. The timelines are collapsing back together, and only one version of history will survive. You have to choose which world becomes real, because you're the observer, the quantum witness. Your consciousness will determine which timeline integrates into fixed reality." "I don't understand," Kelly said to her own alternate face. "How can I choose?" "The broadcasts are showing you options. Each timeline branches from key decision points in history. You have to decide which choices should have been made, which paths humanity should have followed. Your decision will retroactively determine what's real, will collapse all alternate timelines into the single history you select." Kelly's mind reeled. She was being asked to choose reality itself, to decide which version of history should exist. The responsibility was crushing, impossible. How could one person make that choice? How could anyone decide which timeline deserved to be real? The broadcasts intensified, showing her dozens of timelines simultaneously, all clamoring for her attention, all presenting their case for reality. A world where renewable energy had prevented climate change. A world where global communism had succeeded. A world where technology had advanced faster, slower, differently. A world where she'd made different choices in her own life, where she'd never become a trucker, where she'd married her college boyfriend, where she'd had children or stayed childless or died young in a car accident that hadn't happened in this timeline but had happened in others. "Stop," Kelly begged. But the broadcasts continued, overwhelming her with possibilities. She couldn't choose, couldn't commit to one timeline over all others. Every choice meant erasing billions of lives that existed in other branches, meant deciding that their experiences, their loves and losses and dreams were less real than the alternatives. Her CB radio began to smoke, the circuits overloading from the impossible signals they were processing. The video and the static became fractured, showing all timelines simultaneously, and Kelly saw the truth. They were all equally real, all equally valid, all existing in superposition until an observer collapsed them into singular history. And she was that observer, whether she wanted to be or not. By receiving these broadcasts, by witnessing these alternate timelines, she'd become the quantum point around which reality would crystallize. Her choice, or her refusal to choose, would determine which world survived and which worlds faded into might have been. Kelly pulled over, unable to drive while processing this impossible responsibility. She sat in her truck, surrounded by broadcasts from infinite timelines, and tried to figure out how to make a choice that would affect the existence of countless, billions across multiple versions of reality. The weight of it was paralyzing, maddening, and Kelly understood why she'd been chosen. Not because she was special, but because she was ordinary, alone on a highway at 3 a.m., isolated enough to receive the broadcasts without interference from other observers. She was the random quantum event, the coin flip that would determine everything. Kelly made her choice. She chose her own timeline, the reality she'd lived in. Not because it was better or worse than the alternatives, but because it was hers. The people she knew existed here, the history she'd experienced was this one, and erasing it to make room for some hypothetical better timeline felt like betrayal. The moment she decided, the broadcasts stopped. The CB radio went silent, the smoke cleared, and Kelly's truck was just a truck again, sitting on a normal highway in a singular reality. The alternate timelines collapsed or continued existing in parallel without intersection, or had never existed at all except as quantum possibilities that Kelly had refused to manifest. She drove the rest of the way to Texas in silence, delivered her cargo, and never told anyone about the broadcasts. What could she say that wouldn't sound insane? That she'd been given the power to choose reality itself? That infinite timelines had compressed into her CB radio and asked her to decide which world deserved to exist? Nobody would believe her, and maybe that was right. Maybe it had all been hallucination, fatigue-induced delusion, her brain misfiring after too many hours on the road. But Kelly knew the truth. She'd received broadcasts from alternate timelines, and she'd chosen to preserve her own. And somewhere, in parallel branches of possibility that would never intersect with hers again, other versions of Kelly were making different choices, selecting different realities, creating an infinite multiverse where every decision mattered and every observer collapsed their own version of truth into being. The broadcast truck kept driving, kept receiving signals from nowhere, but Kelly Ferguson had chosen her world and would live in it without regrets, without wondering what else might have been. Reality was what you observed, and she'd observed this one, had claimed it as real through the simple act of witnessing. That would have to be enough. Story 10. The Final Mile. Christopher Blake's GPS indicated one more mile to his destination, and that mile had lasted for 3 hours now. His truck driving continuously but never covering the final distance. The exit always just ahead but never arriving, and Chris realized he'd entered a recursive loop in space where distance had become meaningless, and movement was just performative repetition of the same mile over and over forever. He'd been hauling furniture from North Carolina to a warehouse in rural Virginia, following GPS directions through increasingly remote back roads when the final mile had begun. The GPS showed his destination clearly, warehouse visible as a blue icon marked as 0.2 miles ahead. Chris had been driving toward it for hours, maintaining steady speed, covering ground, but the distance never decreased. 0.2 miles perpetually, like he was on a treadmill, moving but staying stationary relative to his goal. Chris had tried stopping, tried turning around, but the road was narrow with no shoulders, and when he'd attempted a three-point turn, the road had extended itself, creating more length to prevent his reversal. He was trapped going forward, stuck in a mile that refused to end, approaching a destination he could see but never reach. The landscape was repeating too. Chris noticed the same abandoned gas station passing on his right multiple times, the same twisted oak tree on his left. He was looping through space, driving the same section of road repeatedly, though his odometer insisted he'd covered 70 miles in the past 3 hours. The numbers were increasing, but the distance was lying, or distance itself had broken in this space. His fuel gauge showed quarter tank, then half tank, then 3/4, cycling randomly. His clock alternated between 4:47 p.m. and 4:48 p.m., unable to progress past those 2 minutes. Time was looping too, or had stopped entirely, and Chris was driving through a frozen moment that had been extended into infinity. He tried his phone, found no signal, which was normal for rural Virginia. But when he checked his photos, they were all the same image repeated thousands of times. The road ahead, the warehouse in the distance, the GPS showing 0.2 miles. Every photo he'd ever taken had been replaced by this single moment, as if his entire history had collapsed into the eternal present of the final mile. "What is this place?" Chris asked aloud, and was startled when something answered. The voice came from his radio, though he hadn't turned it on. "This is the asymptotic approach, Christopher, the mathematical concept made physical. You're experiencing Zeno's paradox in real space. To reach your destination, you must first cover half the distance, then half the remaining distance, then half of that, each interval becoming smaller but never reaching zero, never completing the journey." Chris felt cold terror settle into his bones. Zeno's paradox, the ancient philosophical problem suggesting motion was impossible because you'd have to traverse infinite subdivisions of distance. It was supposed to be theoretical, a thought experiment, not something that could actually trap a driver in an endless approach to a warehouse. "How do I escape?" Chris demanded. "You don't. The final mile is where journeys end without ending, where delivery becomes impossible, where drivers discover that arrival was always an illusion, that we're all forever traveling toward destinations we'll never reach." Chris looked at his GPS, at the blue icon, representing the warehouse, and saw it was pulsing, mocking him with its proximity. 0.2 miles. If he drove for 1,000,000 years, the GPS would still show 0.2 miles. The distance was fixed, eternal, and Chris was trapped approaching it forever. He thought about his wife, his kids, his life outside this truck. They seemed distant now, theoretical, less real than the road beneath his tires and the warehouse he'd never reach. How long had he been in the final mile? 3 hours, the rational part of his brain insisted. But it felt longer, felt like he'd been driving this road for years, for decades, for all of time. Other vehicles appeared ahead, also driving the final mile. Chris could see them through the repetitions of landscape, other trucks and cars all approaching the same warehouse, all trapped in the same asymptotic approach. Some drivers looked panicked, gripping their steering wheels with desperate intensity. Others looked resigned, accepting, as if they'd made peace with eternal travel. Chris pulled alongside a semi, honked to get the driver's attention. The woman behind the wheel was ancient, her face lined with centuries of age, and she smiled at Chris with sad understanding. She'd been in the final mile for a very long time, Chris realized. Maybe forever. Maybe she'd always been there, had never existed anywhere except in this recursive space. "First time?" she mouthed through her window. Chris nodded, unable to speak. "It gets easier," she mouthed back. "Eventually you forget what arrival feels like. Eventually the journey becomes enough." But Chris didn't want that acceptance, that resignation to eternal incompletion. He wanted to reach the warehouse, wanted to unload his cargo and drive home to his family. He wanted the journey to end, to matter, to accomplish something instead of just continuing forever. An idea formed. If this was Zeno's paradox made real, if distance was subdividing infinitely, then maybe Chris needed to stop thinking about distance. The paradox assumed continuous space, discrete intervals that had to be traversed. But what if space wasn't continuous? What if he could quantum tunnel through the final subdivisions, jump directly to the destination without traversing the infinite intervals between? Chris closed his eyes, stopped watching the GPS, stopped measuring his progress. He cleared his mind of mathematics and logic and just drove, not toward the warehouse, but simply drove, existing in motion without goal or measurement. He let go of arrival as a concept, let go of distance as something that had to be crossed. When he opened his eyes, his truck was in the warehouse parking lot, engine off, cargo delivered. Chris blinked, confused, and checked his GPS. It showed him at the destination, 0 miles remaining. His clock read 4:49 p.m., time having finally progressed. His odometer showed the expected mileage. The warehouse supervisor approached, clipboard in hand, looking annoyed. "You're late. We've been waiting." "How long?" Chris asked. 20 minutes. You were due at 4:30. 20 minutes. Not hours, not years, not the eternity it had felt like. Chris had experienced the final mile as infinite approach, but in external time only 20 minutes had passed. The loop had been temporal as well as spatial, creating subjective infinity within objective brevity. Chris signed the delivery papers, watched his furniture unloaded, and drove away from the warehouse as quickly as he could. He took different roads going back, avoided the route that had trapped him, and made it home without incident. But Chris Blake never forgot the final mile, never forgot the sensation of approaching without arriving, moving without progressing, existing in the space between departure and destination where journeys became eternal. He quit long-haul trucking 2 weeks later, took a local job that kept him close to home. Because Chris had learned something in that final mile, something that made his old career impossible. Arrival was never guaranteed. Destinations could recede infinitely, and some roads led to places where the journey never ended, where drivers traveled forever through recursive space, approaching goals they'd never reach. Living out Zeno's paradox in real time until they forgot what completion felt like and accepted that travel itself was the only reality they'd ever know. And sometimes, late at night, Chris still felt like he was in that final mile, still approaching the warehouse, still trapped in 0.2 miles of infinite subdivision. His home, his family, his life all felt like the illusion, and the eternal road felt like truth. Maybe he'd never escaped. Maybe he was still driving, still trapped, and everything since was just a dream his mind constructed to cope with infinite travel. There was no way to know for certain, no way to prove he'd ever arrived. The final mile was patient. It would wait. And if Chris ever found himself on that Virginia back road again, following GPS toward a warehouse that was always 0.2 miles away, he'd know he'd never left at all, had just been living a fantasy of arrival while his truck drove endless loops through recursive space, forever approaching, forever traveling, forever trapped in the last distance before destination, where motion became meaningless and arrival became myth, and drivers learned that some journeys were designed never to end.